Welcome back. In our previous lesson, we did learn about the pathway that an impulse take from a stimulus through the nervous system until a response is carried out. So today we are going to look at the mode of transmission of impulses from a receptor to integrating center and then to the effector until a response is carried out. Now, if you look at this diagram, we know that actually afferent neuron, also known as sensory neuron, transmit the impulses from the receptor to the integrating center. Then, in the integrating center, we have the interneurons to integrate the information, to process and then interpret the information before new impulses are transmitted to via the afferent neuron to the effector. So before we start, perhaps it is useful for us to know the different parts, okay, the name for the different parts of a neuron. Now this is a typical neuron. Now let the arrow be the nerve, the direction of the nerve transmission. Now so I'm going to label them first. Now look at it. Now the part that houses the nucleus and the organelles is known as the cell body. The part that transmit the impulses towards the cell body is known as dendron. Now dendron in Greek, okay, in Greek means tree. See, it looks like the branches of tree. Then the part that transmit the impulses away from the cell body is known as axon. Now this is an axon. A smaller dendron is known as dendrite. A smaller axon is known as axon terminal. And at the end of the axon terminal, we will be able to see a knob-shaped structure, which is known as synaptic knob. Now the red arrows here represents the direction of the transmission of nerve impulses. So it is from the dendrite to the dendron to the cell body before the impulse is transmitted through the axon terminal until synaptic knob. Alright, now please allow me to introduce to you three types of neurons. Now the first one, if you look at it, now the cell body as compared to the cell body in the motor neuron. The cell body in sensory neuron is situated at the middle of the neuron, while in motor neuron, the cell body is located at one end. The sensory neuron has a very long, you see that? Now this is a long dendron together with long axon. On the other hand, motor neuron has a very short dendron but a very long axon. What about interneuron? Interneuron is also known as a relay neuron. Now it has short axon and dendron. Now, then what about this coating? This coating is shown here. This coating is known as the myelin sheath. Now, myelin sheath is actually cholesterol. Now it gives the protection. Number one, it protects the dendron together with the axon. And number two, it also insulates the axons and dendron, so that the nerve impulses actually don't flow along them. Instead of flowing along them, electrical impulses actually leap from one node to the other node. So the part without the coating is known as the node. This is a node of Granville. Now, please take note that not all animals have the myelin sheath. The reason is because only the advanced ones have it. Only the advanced ones are able. Now with this myelin sheath, we can actually respond faster because the impulses don't flow. The impulses leap instead. So the transmission, the rate of transmission of nerve impulses is faster this way. So we will be able to see the nerve fibers with myelin shift in octopus, for example, in humans, for example, mammals, for example, because we are able, if you look at it, our response is actually very fast. Okay, we got to say a big thanks to myelin shift. If you look at this diagram, you will be surprised to see that actually they don't overlap. This is the axon terminal of the motor neuron. It actually doesn't overlap. You see, it doesn't overlap. There is actually a very tiny gap between the axon, the synaptic knob or the axon terminal of one neuron to the other, the dendrite of another neuron. Now, what is this gap and what is it for? Now, please allow me to bring you to this diagram. Now, there is actually a tiny gap between the neurons, and this tiny gap is known as a synaptic cleft. So let this one be the axon terminal, and then at the end of the axon terminal, you will be able to see the synaptic knob. Inside the synaptic knob, we will be able to find vesicles which contain a lot of neurotransmitter. All right. So what are neurotransmitter? Now, neurotransmitter are messenger. They are chemical messenger. So which means to say that the mode of transmission along the axon and the dendron is actually, it comes in the form of electrical impulses. But the electrical impulses wouldn't be able to transmit across a gap here. So as a result, we need to release chemical messenger known as neurotransmitter. Then inside this synaptic knob also, you will be able to find a lot of mitochondria. Now let's see what will happen. Now once an impulse arrives at the synaptic knob, now this impulse is going to stimulate the vesicles containing the neurotransmitter to move towards this membrane. Now this membrane is known as the presynaptic membrane. Once the vesicle moves and fuses with the presynaptic membrane, neurotransmitter are released into the gap here. Alright, the movement of the vesicles is actually aided by the mitochondria. Now, so what happens next? The neurotransmitter then diffuse across the gap and attach to the receptors found on the postsynaptic membrane. Now, once the receptors are stimulated, new impulses are formed, are triggered, and the new impulses are then transmitted through the dendron of another neuron. Now, you might ask me, what is the importance of having a gap between the neurons? Now, the answer is actually quite clear. Now, what will happen? What will happen to your body if the impulses are allowed to transmit this way and back to this way? It might confuse your sensory neuron. It might confuse your receptors. Who am I? Am I a receptor or an effector? So to ensure that the transmission of nerve impulses is actually one way, so we need to have this gap, and this gap is what we call a synapse. This gap is also known as synapse. Thanks to synapse, that's why our nerve transmission is one way. Just imagine that if we have copper wire, instead of nerve fiber, instead of synapse, then the transmission of electrical impulses is actually bidirectional. Now it is going to cause a lot of confusion in our nervous system. Okay, let's recall. So what have we learned just now? Now we learned about the three types of neurons: afferent neuron, interneuron, and efferent neuron. And then the differences between them, if you look at it, this is an afferent neuron. The cell body is actually at the middle of the neuron, while in afferent neuron, the cell body is actually at one end of the neuron. Interneuron has short dendron and axon. Afferent neuron has long and long. Both the dendrons and the axons are both long. While in afferent neuron, the dendron is actually short. It's actually short, but it has a very long axon. And then what actually separate between them? Then we have the synapse. Now the synapse are shown here. Now by right, we should learn how to draw a synapse. Now perhaps you should practice. Now there should be an essay on the transmission of nerve impulses across the synapse. Now let this one be the axon terminal, and that's why this must be the synaptic knob. And then inside the synaptic knob, we will be able to find a lot of vesicles with neurotransmitters. Of course, we will be able to find organelles which have two membranes with the inner membrane folded. And then once the nerve impulses arrive at the synaptic knob, the vesicles will be stimulated to move and fuse together with the presynaptic membrane, releasing the neurotransmitter into the synapse. And then on the surface of the postsynaptic membrane, you will be able to see receptors. All these are receptors and receptors. Once the neurotransmitters bind with receptors, new impulses are formed. That's why impulses can transmit across the synapse to another neuron this way. And the reason of having synapse is to ensure that the transmission of nerve impulses is one way. Alright, so with this, thank you so much. See you again.